This is the story of how an enslaved woman turned a lifetime of humiliation into a single meal, and then let the night finish what the kitchen began. Flames walking the rows until the whole plantation glowed like a bad memory. If hidden chapters like this pull you in, hit like, subscribe, and tell in the comments where you're watching from. New investigations drop often. Don't miss the next one. Camellia Ben sat on a rise outside Port Royal, where the tidal rivers stitch the marshes to the sea and live oaks bent in permanent boughs. The owner, Colonel Silas Brecken, ran the place like a courthouse where sentences were work and mockery was sport. His wife, Eugenia, ruled the house with lace gloves and a bright, practiced laugh that bit as hard as any whip. That laugh followed one person most. Her name in the quarters was Zillah, head cook by skill and by survival, a woman the household trained itself to overlook until supper called for miracles. Zillah had been bought in Charleston years earlier, a transfer recorded neat as any ledger line. The day money changed hands, a child was pulled from her, sold downriver, and the auctioneer joked about a kitchen hand who cried more salt than she'd ever use in soup. People laughed. The buyers laughed. Eugenia laughed loudest. They laughed again when Zillah's burned hand blistered after hauling kettles too heavy for a small frame. They laughed when she mispronounced a word on purpose to avoid a beating for knowing too much. Laughter lived in those walls like mildew, and Zillah wore it the way smoke wears a hearth. Humiliation became a season that never ended. The mistress had a way of calling her pet names that were not pet names, of tapping a spoon on Zillah's shoulder as if she were a sideboard. She mimed the cook's careful walk in front of guests until the room brightened with amusement, imitating the stiffness left by an old hip injury that never healed. She brought visitors through the kitchen to show off the braided breads and the immaculate hearth, then told them the cook was clever the way a trick pony is clever. People laughed at that in the soft manner of drawing rooms. It was refined laughter, but laughter all the same. The field hand said the house could be found in fog by sound alone. Follow the laughter and you'll get there. A lifetime of being the punchline teaches composition. Zillah learned the temperatures of scorn and the timings of danger. She learned what salt could hide and what smoke could forgive. She learned from the butcher how to joint a thing clean, so the bones stacked like tidy sentences. She learned from the soap kettles how lie bites fat into obedience, and how hot liquid can erase what should not be found. In a place that denied her schooling, the kitchen wrote its own textbook, and humiliation turned each lesson's page. Eugenia delighted in reminding guests that Zillah had clever hands but a small mind. She delighted in misnaming her on purpose. She delighted in tossing scraps to the floor as if feeding a dog and waiting to see whether the cook would break and stoop. Zillah would not stoop. That, too, made people laugh. Once, after a church social, Eugenia retold a story in the parlor about Zillah dropping a pie. She waved her silk fan and imitated the flustered apology the cook had never given. Again, laughter. That night, Zillah stood alone in the buttery and pressed her palm against the cold wall until the ache passed. She whispered nothing anyone could hear. Silence had always been the language that kept her alive. The day the plantation ledger noted a domestic indisposition, the marsh birds rose from the reeds as if called. Eugenia had left the house late morning for a small stroll around the camellia beds and did not return. In the big house, that registered as inconvenience before worry. Supper would still require a show. The colonel had guests. The table would shine. Zillah received the instructions with lowered eyes, as she always did, and set about a menu Eugenia used to brag over to the ladies in Beaufort. A broth that could make a sick man stand, a roast that could make a preacher swear, a stew that tasted like home. By sundown, the dining room was a theater. The colonel practiced his toasts in the mirror, holding his belly like a man who believes he built it himself. He joked that the stew would be a tribute to his dear wife's signature, camellia stew, named so because it was delicate but unforgettable. Guests smiled, some smirked. A few servants behind the door shared a glance so fast it might have been a blink. In the kitchen, Zillah ladled steam over her face until sweat disguised anything else that might mark her. She hummed a tune her mother had used to mark time, drawing the melody low so it would not be mistaken for happiness. She moved like a person who had never been allowed to be seen and now had to keep that invisibility intact. She had chosen her moment 2 nights earlier, when Eugenia's teasing turned intimate and cruel. The mistress told a visiting cousin how amusing it was to watch Zillah pretend not to read labels, to watch her play dumb the way a cat plays dead. She said ignorance in a slave was like a ribbon on a whip. It made the thing prettier without changing what it did. The room laughed. Zillah did not. What came after was a sequence of tasks any kitchen understands: the grab of the cleaver, the steadiness of a board, the certainty that bone will give if you find its seam. In the smokehouse, where fat drips mark time like clocks, the cook worked with a focus that emptied the body of tremor. There was no haste. Haste betrays. There was no spectacle. Spectacle invites interruption. There was only heat and blade and silence. When the work was done, the scullery ran dark water twice, then twice again, until what had been there was a rumor the drains would keep. The stew pot took what it was given and told no one. Aromatics did the rest. Bay leaves blurred memory. Wine reduced truth to a glaze. Even the iron took part, lending its old metallic whisper that made every spoonful taste like history. The meat fell into strands under the weight of time and heat, and even close eyes would have called it something respectable. Zillah salted it the way she had learned to salt a life, exactly enough to dull what should not be tasted. All evening the house laughed on schedule, not knowing the joke had moved rooms. Guests praised Zillah by praising the colonel's household. They scooped seconds and declared the old recipes best. At the head of the table, a place setting remained empty. Eugenia's chair pulled back just so. Someone remarked that the air felt lighter without her corrections. Someone mimed her exacting little cough. The humor was easy, the way habitual unkindness makes anything easy. Zillah stood in the doorway, hands folded over an apron older than some of the guests, and watched people savor the last performance the mistress would ever headline. Outside, the gin houses breathed cotton dust, a soft haze that turned lamplight into halos. The night breeze had a dryness to it that made tinder of anything that would cooperate. Zillah knew that air. She felt it when she stepped briefly into the yard and tested the direction of the wind with a wetted finger, the way the blacksmith tested draft before feeding the forge. She walked past the sheds and the tar barrels and the piled cane like a woman counting exits in a theater. Laughter spilled from the dining room in bright waves that broke against her back. It sounded almost like rain. This was not an impulse. It had been measured in humiliations and calibrated in insults. She had been jeered for walking too slow and mocked for moving too quick. She had been slapped for speaking and mocked for silence. She had been made the house's joke so often that people assumed she could not hear the punchlines. This plan accounted for all of that. It counted on the colonel's second glass, on the gentleman's third plate, on the habit of ignoring the person who feeds you. It counted on laughter to keep heads turned. The first spark was ordinary, a lantern lifted too close to lint, a careless brush where cotton meets flame. The second spark was not an accident at all. Tar remembers the finger that wakes it. Zillah set what she set and walked away without a backward glance, the way a woman learns to walk from a room where she has just been ridiculed and must pretend it did not touch her. Fire likes a path. It found one along the cotton trash and the dry husks, under the wooden sills kissed by summer after summer of sun. It ran quiet at first, then spoke. Back in the dining room, the colonel finished his toast, a roll of words about order and providence, and the world arranged as it should be. People lifted glasses, people smirked. People praised the stew again and asked for its secret. The kitchen door opened and closed on hinges that had learned not to squeal. In the passage, house servants moved with practiced calm, eyes lowered, ears alive. Some had dreamed of nights like this and woke sweating from the dreaming. Some had prayed to never live a night like this and now listened for the right moment to choose. None of them would ever forget the way the air changed when the fire found breath. Zillah held her station at the threshold, that strip of floorboards where heat from the kitchen meets the cooler parlor air. She could smell the first truth of smoke underneath gravy and wine, a low note rising. She could feel the house's laughter waver, as if some invisible conductor had missed a cue. She remembered every time Eugenia had made a circle of company at Zillah's expense, mimicking a limp, comparing scars to cracked china, chuckling that her cook could follow a recipe the way a hound follows a scent. She remembered the way the cousins snickered when the colonel called her girl in front of children. She remembered each practiced humiliation and stacked them like kindling. What she did next was simple and final. She lifted the tureen again and served one last ladle with hands that did not shake. She wiped the rim the way she had been taught until the porcelain shone. She nodded for the footman to carry in the cake that no longer required a lady to cut it. Then she slipped back through the service hall, past the pantry, past the buttery, past the locked closet where the recipes Eugenia claimed as her own had always lived in Zillah's head. She stepped into the yard where the wind had turned toward the house, and the gin houses had begun to roar like an approaching train. Embers chased one another along the picket fence. The sky over the rows brightened in a color fields should never wear. On the back steps, a young maid paused with a stack of plates, eyes wide, and glanced toward Zillah as if asking a question without words. Zillah answered without words. She pointed once toward the river path, once toward the quarters, and once toward the stand of pines no one watched at night. Her expression held no triumph, only the stony composure of someone who has heard laughs all her life and learned at last how to answer without speaking. Inside, the dining room murmured at the first hint of smoke curling under the door. A guest joked it was the stew's exuberance. Another made a remark about the kitchen needing more discipline. Someone laughed, short and confident, because laughter is the last tool of people sure they will not burn. In the yard, sparks leapt like insects. Roof shingles took the message and repeated it, shingle to shingle, beam to beam. Zillah crossed the packed dirt yard and did not look back. Behind her, the night accepted the work she had set in motion. Ahead, the river lay black and plain, its surface untroubled, a road without ruts. In the space between, the plantation she had been mocked in, laughed at in, belittled in, began to glow from within like a coal answering breath. The meal was over. The house would not be long behind it. The laughter that had built these rooms finally learned what silence sounds like when flame speaks louder. The investigation would call what happened an outrage, a catastrophe, a crime beyond words. Act 2 would think it could count costs and find culprits. But for now, the night did its arithmetic in firelight, and the woman who had been laughed at her entire life walked toward the only place in the Low Country that never laughed at anyone. The dark water, steady and expressionless, waiting to receive a person who had learned how to disappear. By dawn, the smoke thinned into gray ribbons that hung between the live oaks like torn fabric. The gin houses were black shells. The big house stood, but its roofline pulsed with a slow, sullen glow where embers slept and woke, slept and woke. Chickens pecked at ash as if the night had only been weather. The river went on being river, and the marsh answered with its patient rotted sweetness. What had been laughter inside Camellia Bend now lived only in echoes, thin and unbecoming. County men arrived on borrowed horses and borrowed certainty. A constable with a brass star, a physician with a case that smelled faintly of spirit, an assessor from the city with a ledger bound in calfskin, and a handful of neighboring planters who treated calamity as a committee sport. They formed a line on the veranda and stared at the cracked parlor windows. The colonel kept to a chair with a shawl around his shoulders, composed in the practiced way of men who assume that nothing essential can happen without their consent. He repeated that the mistress had gone for a stroll. He repeated that the fire was an act of God. He repeated what he needed to hear, and around him the morning collected facts that disagreed. The first fact lay in the earth. An arrowhead pattern burned into the yard boards that pointed back toward the cotton trash pile, and, beyond that, to the tar barrels. One spark wanders. Several sparks conspire. The constable squinted and noted, without needing to write, that fire had moved in more than one direction at once. The breeze off the river had helped, but the breeze alone did not pick its targets. The assessor bent and tapped the chair with his pencil, already calculating losses and premiums and whether the colonel's policy would call this providence or fraud. The second fact lived in the kitchen. Soot ringed the mantel. The iron stew pot sat on the hearth in the attitude of an instrument at rest. The scullery water was still black, though the maids had drawn new buckets. A side table held a cleaver with its handle scrubbed pale, and a whetstone that still wore a damp crescent where someone had tested an edge. In the ash pit out back, the gardeners sifted with shovels until the physician called halt and knelt. He lifted a fragment no larger than a biscuit, turned it in his palm, and saw cut lines too regular for accident. A pig is jointed one way, a deer another, a human something else again. A man trained to set wrists and separate ribs for fever checks knows the signatures of blade and bone. He did not say it aloud. He set the fragment in a folded handkerchief and carried on. The third fact was absence. Eugenia's closet held dresses that would not be worn again, gloves that still remembered hands, a jewelry box with the tiny scolds of metal on wood when the lid was shut in a hurry. On the dressing table, a cameo lay where someone leaving in haste would not have left it. The housekeeper observed, because housekeepers notice, that the mistress would not have walked the beds at dusk without her sunshade and her particular hat pin. Both were still in place, accusing the doorway by their presence. No footprints marked the flower paths except the trampled confusion made by men after the fire. The fourth fact perched on the edge of a soup plate. A shard of enamel with a chip shaped like a crescent. The physician set beside it a second, smaller item found in the ash pit, and somewhere in the house a maid steadied herself against a wall. In the world of parlors, there are certain shapes that cannot be mistaken. The colonel averted his gaze and requested more coffee, as if appetite were a verdict. The inquiry began in the dining room, because that was the room that still held chairs. The constable called for names, one by one, and everyone assembled produced orderly recollections that did not quite fit. Servants had moved as servants move, quiet and invisible unless things go wrong. The footman had carried plates. The parlor maid had refilled glasses. The young maid on the back steps had seen nothing, and yet could describe the sky. The housekeeper, a woman who wore a lifetime of reprimands like rings, recited times and tasks with all the careful neutrality of someone who had heard laughter aimed mostly at others and knew it could swivel at any moment. Every testimony circled the same figure. Zillah was present. Zillah was composed. Zillah was competent beyond dispute. Zillah moved through the kitchen like a person who knew the difference between heat and flame, and had learned that bodies can be burned by more than fire. Again and again, the recounting tripped over the house's own habit of contempt. Witnesses, trying to be helpful, drew small portraits of the mistress's past entertainments. Her imitations of the cook's gait, her performance of the cook's supposed ignorance, her parties made buoyant by mockery. They did not understand that each recollection added kindling to the picture building in the constable's notes. They had laughed at Zillah for years, had laughed at her burns, her scars, her accent when it suited the mistress to display her. They had laughed at her small acts of dignity as if those were new jokes. In the dining room's weak daylight, those memories did not feel like anecdotes. They felt like motive given form. The assessor asked after food stores and livestock. He walked the pens and counted slowly, tapping the fence rails. The hogs were all there. The smokehouse still held what it had held the week before. No carcass had been brought in that day. The kitchen ledger recorded flour and salt and wine and bay, all in quantities that fit a generous supper. Nowhere in the accounts did a new quarter of pork appear. The assessor, who had no patience for sentiment, wrote a line in his book that said simply that dinner did not match inventory. Down by the ash pit, the physician and two farmhands sifted as if panning a river for flakes. More fragments rose. Some were no more telling than shell, but others, when rinsed in a basin, resolved into pieces that had once been arranged in the only pattern that carries breath. A ring setting with an empty mouth, the cameo's twin, a scrap of corset stay warped by heat. The physician built a row of evidence on a clean board, not theatrical, merely honest. He sent a boy to fetch the constable, and after a private exchange, the men agreed that the fragile comforts of euphemism had been spent. News traveled on the wind. In the quarters, stories began to sort themselves. Some remembered Zillah stepping into a blow and keeping her gaze on a distant point as the mistress laughed. Some remembered a winter stew that had saved a fevered child, and how the mistress had claimed the praise for herself. Some remembered the way Zillah squared her shoulders before entering a room where she knew she would be treated as a joke, as if posture itself were a shield. None of them had heard her complain. Silence had been her instrument. That silence hummed now under every observation as the inquiry moved from room to room. By afternoon, the line between accident and intent had sharpened. The assessor sketched a map of the yard with little crosses where fire had started independently. The constable set down the path from the kitchen to the smokehouse to the tar barrels, and from there to the gin houses. The physician folded his handkerchief around the fragments and wrote a slip to accompany them to town. The housekeeper fetched the key to the recipe's closet, the one the mistress liked to show guests as proof that house knowledge lived on paper and not in black hands. The closet held receipts copied in the mistress's clean script, but none of them could explain a stew that bore no resemblance to anything expected. Knowledge had lived in Zillah's hands, and the mistress had turned that knowledge into a parlor trick with laughter. Records could not explain the absence of a body. The kitchen could. Late in the day, a ferryman from the river landing came up the road with a hat in his hands. He had seen a woman walking before dawn, a bundle under her arm, head wrapped, pace steady. She had not begged passage. She had used the marsh track that locals take when they prefer to avoid questions. The ferryman, a man with a private ledger of what he would not repeat, made his statement and departed, and the constable followed the river path with his eyes, measuring distances against chances. He had chased desperation before and knew its stride. He had also watched the plantation's habit of laughter and knew its sound. He did not say which he found more persuasive. The colonel offered the expected explanations, then the expected denials, then the expected outrage. He repeated that the mistress surely wandered. He repeated that loss had undone his memory of the night. He repeated the narrative of a house that had always made sense to him. Superior and inferior, patent and hidden, masters of ceremony and the hands who kept the candles lit. He did not repeat the jokes, but others did, almost tenderly, as if those jokes could not possibly in hindsight be evidence of anything except society. The inquiry took it all down, because that is what inquiries do. A broadside went up at the post road by evening. A notice for a missing woman named for the cook, and a promise of a reward that sounded large to people with little and small to people with much. The letters were inked bold enough to be read from a saddle. The description mentioned scars that had been the house's source of amusement. It mentioned the set of the shoulders that had been mimicked in drawing rooms. It mentioned a limp that had been passed around like a party favor. Every word revealed the plantation's long record of seeing and not seeing at once. Before the men broke for their suppers, the physician returned to the ash pit and stood with his hat in his hand. He regarded the pattern of recovered fragments and understood, in the restrained way of his profession, that the dining room had hosted both wake and feast without knowing which was which. He understood that kitchens can be courts. He understood that laughter, repeated often enough, becomes a substance one can set a match to. He closed his case and told the constable that the findings, when written, would be plain. That night, the surviving servants gathered in low voices to decide where sleep could be trusted. Some went to relatives along the river. Some stayed close in case the inquiry turned vindictive and needed witnesses who could not be found. A few stood on the back steps and tried to hear, above the cricket noise, the long, thin thread of a woman moving through marsh grass. The young maid who had seen the sky looked at the place where Zillah had pointed, toward the path, toward the quarters, toward the stand of pines. She held fast to the fact that the cook who had been laughed at was the same cook who had quietly fed the hungry whenever rations ran thin. People can be more than jokes and more than their last act. She let that knowledge anchor her. By the time the stars found their usual places, the plantation was reduced to inventory, losses to be toted, statements to be taken, searches to be organized, blame to be distributed with tidy hands. But the story no longer fit into ledgers. It spilled into the marsh and along the river, carried by mouths that had learned discretion the hard way. Word said the cook had endured humiliation until endurance became a plan. Word said the woman who had been laughed at had burned the laughter out of the walls. Word said she had served a final course that no one would admit tasting. The inquiry set a date for a formal inquest and a day for searching the reed beds. Men in coats believed the next steps were simple: gather, declare, pursue. They did not see the other investigation already underway, the quiet tallies made in the quarters, the reckoning in hearts that had watched cruelty dressed as wit. The plantation had trained itself to laugh at Zillah. The plantation now taught itself how to fear the memory of being laughed at. Somewhere beyond the last fence line, a woman walked with a steady pace and a bundle of bread wrapped in cloth. She kept to the shadowed side of the palmettos and listened for dogs that might be loosed. She did not hurry. Haste betrays. She did not gloat. Triumph is loud and draws attention. She moved like someone who had spent a lifetime being looked at without being seen, and had finally learned how to shape that invisibility into a path. The next act belonged to men with badges and papers. For the moment, the night closed around her as naturally as breath, and the river kept its promise to all who travel it quietly. The search started before full light, when river mist still clung to the cordgrass, and the pluff mud breathed its slow, tidal breath. Riders traced the fence lines. Men on foot worked the marsh edges with poles, testing for disturbed ground. Hounds were brought, unimpressed by ash, confused by brackish water. Tracks at the kitchen yard scattered into the scuff of many boots. A clearer trail ran down the service path and dissolved at the reeds, as if a careful walker had stepped onto water and learned how to keep going. By noon, the sun found every reflective surface left on the place and named it Ruin. In town, an inquest took shape in rooms that smelled of lemon oil and old paper. The constable laid out recovered items on a cloth. A cameo twin to the one in the mistress's dressing room, a ring setting warped by heat, the slender length of a corset stay curled by flame. The physician followed, with a small tray where fragments lay rinsed and bleak, their cut edges too deliberate for accident. The assessor added a sketch of the yard with crosses where separate burns began, his pencil lines marching like a verdict no one wanted to read aloud. The housekeeper delivered keys and ledgers and a single unadorned observation. The mistress would not have left her hatpin or a sunshade to tour the camellias. All of it formed a pattern plainer than anyone wished. Testimony built in layers. The ferryman described a woman moving along the marsh track before dawn, head wrapped, bundle small, stride steady. He made no performance of it. He simply placed the figure where he had seen it and left his words there like a stake. The footman accounted for plates and platters, the parlor maid for glasses and draughts, the gardener for the ash pit where the first grim findings were uncovered. Each witness, trying to be exact, also returned to Zillah without intending to. How she moved without sound. How she kept her face still when the mistress rehearsed new jokes. How she had, for years, been the axis around which supper turned and mockery spun. The record gathered these repetitions the way embers gather in a hearth. Separate, then one. The laughter that had chased Zillah through rooms became an exhibit with fingerprints on it. The mistress's imitations of a limp, the spoon taps on a shoulder as if on furniture, the habit of calling pet names that were insults, the spectacle of parading guests through the kitchen to praise food and belittle the person whose hands produced it. Each recollection settled into the ledger of cause. Her humiliation was not background color, it was motive given routine, a daily abrasion that had finally abraded through. By late afternoon, the panel's language turned spare. The verdict named a death without a body and a fire without providence. The mistress of Camellia Bend was declared lost by homicidal means, with culinary preparation and burning used to destroy remains. The cause was described clinically, without flourish. The suspect was named in the plain style reserved for people the courthouse expected never to see again. A warrant was issued. A notice promised money for information and named scars long mocked in parlors as identifying marks, turning the plantation's earlier contempt into an official inventory. The colonel took the papers with the expression of a man who believes paper can reverse flame. He lamented his losses to anyone willing to listen. He spoke of order and ruin, of civilization and savagery, and of how the world must be held together by the hands born to hold it. Behind those statements lay other arithmetic. Insurance agents visited, compared maps to statements, compared statements to scorch marks, and found the pattern too purposeful to bless. Claims were delayed, then denied. Debts stepped forward. Notes came due. By the time the first cool mornings hinted at another season, Camellia Bend belonged less to the man who had run it and more to the bank that now called it an asset needing liquidation. Laughter had been cheap there, rebuilding was not. The quarters carried out a different reckoning. People spoke of Zillah's steady back and the way she would not stoop for scraps thrown to the floor for sport. They remembered the winter she stretched rations behind the house when sickness ran through the cabins, and the mistress counted that charity against the cost of soap. They remembered the time the mistress imitated Zillah's stiff gait in front of guests, and the cook kept her face still, not from dullness, but from a strength that had learned early what expression could cost. In that telling, humiliation was not a pastime. It was a pressure that finally reshaped the vessel containing it. Searches continued because searches must. Men with badges ran boats along Blackwater creeks and pushed poles into mud that swallows confession whole. Marsh wrens complained at the disturbance and went back to their business. A fisherman swore he saw a head wrap on the far bank one dusky evening, then could not swear to which evening it had been. The ferryman noticed no one who asked for passage who did not belong, which, for a man in his line of work, meant he had noticed everything and would report nothing more. The constable returned to town with wet boots and a ledger heavier with lines than with conclusions. Months pulled the heat out of the ruins. The camellias sent up new leaves on scorched stems because plants obey instructions older than houses. The big house lost its top floor to rain, then its staircase to rot, then its dignity to vines. A new owner arrived, ran a hand over burned brick, and spoke in a measured tone about improvements that never quite materialized. Fields that had once produced bales and accounts produced broom sedge and silence. On certain afternoons when the light slanted just so, people on the road said the place looked like a stage after the orchestra had packed up and gone, the chairs still warm from bodies that would not return. The ledger of outcomes lengthened. The colonel moved inland to relatives and entertained them with a version of events in which he had been besieged by forces beyond reason. In town, the physician filed his report with the calm of a man who measures harm in ounces and inches and knows that harm has no interest in rhetoric. The assessor, pressed by creditors and policy clerks, closed his book on Camellia Bend and moved his attention downriver where other fires would someday bloom for other reasons. The housekeeper found a position in a hotel that prided itself on polish and discretion, and there she kept to herself the kind of stories that no longer improved a room. The young maid who had looked to Zillah for a wordless answer married a dock worker, took a room near the river, and cooked stews that tasted of time and restraint. She laughed rarely and carefully. As for Zillah, she existed where the county map thins, in the memory of a ferryman, in the rumor of a traveling cook who never stayed through a second Sunday, in the spare account of a praise house preacher who recorded an unnamed woman donating a sack of meal and disappearing before anyone could offer thanks. Some said she headed for the Pine Barrens where people with reasons to be nobody could be nobody. Some said she took a coastal schooner under a borrowed name and made a life in a city where a cook's skill could be bartered for days without harassment. Some said she drowned, and the river, notoriously loyal, kept her. The truth never volunteered itself, and the silence that had kept her alive kept her legend intact. The story did one thing reliably: it rearranged laughter. In drawing rooms, the tale was told with nervous bravado, as if boldness could ward off implications. Jokes about kitchen mishaps lost their appetite. Mimicry of a servant's walk drew fewer smiles. The easy sport of turning a person into a prop for amusement had, for a while, the aftertaste of ash. In the quarters, the story did a different kind of work. It reminded people that endurance is not the same as consent, that silence is not void but voltage, that being laughed at without cease is a form of harm that eventually answers back. Years later, a boy, fishing for bream off a fallen cypress, pulled up a spoon blackened to a dull gray. He took it home and his mother rubbed the bowl bright and set it in a drawer. She used it for stews that tasted like whatever the garden could spare and the smokehouse could forgive. She did not think of Camellia Bend when she scooped or stirred. She thought of feeding children until they slept, and of keeping her own laughter soft and private, inside the small circle of her kitchen where no one turned a person into a joke. In time, the place changed hands again and again. Surveyors came with chains and brass compasses, measured the same distances men on horseback had guessed by eye, and wrote new names onto old land. The camellias bloomed with the stubbornness of plants that do not know shame. The veranda's edge collapsed and left teeth of joists pointing at the sky. A schoolteacher brought students out to see history and told a careful story about cause and consequence without naming the stew. The wind lifted her notes and carried them toward the river where words had always been portioned sparingly. What remained could be walked in an hour. The suggestion of a drive, the scattered bricks of a chimney, the rectangular indent where a kitchen once exhaled the day's heat. A person standing there on a windless evening could hear tree frogs, the distant slap of a fish, and, if imagination insisted, a faint echo of laughter that had learned too late how to be quiet. The land absorbed everything as land does. What it would not give back were the small humiliations stacked into something combustible, or the steady back of a woman learning to turn invisibility into method. The record ended as records do, with signatures and a binding that creaked when opened. The story carried on as stories do in rooms where supper steam fogs windows and in yards where charcoal marks still surprise the shovel. No monument named Zillah, and perhaps none ever would. Her name lived instead in a refrain passed low and close, that a person who is mocked does not forget, that a house built on laughter at another's expense is tinder, and that silence, kept long enough and aimed carefully, can be a match. When the tide came in during the late summer, it ran up the riverbank and touched the marsh grass with its clean salt. The char smell had left the place years before, but the lesson remained like iron in well water, traceable, hard to miss once tasted. The wind moved through the live oaks with the soft insistence of distant surf. Somewhere beyond the last fence line that never got rebuilt, a narrow path pressed through palmetto and returned to itself after every footfall, as if remembering a single set of steady steps and the decision that set them in motion. The plantation that had once trained its rooms to laugh stood quiet under a sky that had never taken sides.